Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the Rustic Von Lodge, where today I'm going to be talking about classic fantasy and a reading project that I've got going on. And I am aware that I have too many reading projects. I did a video about that recently, in which I even forgot a couple of the reading projects I have going on. I'll have to make videos about those later, but today we're talking about classic fantasy and the classic fantasy reading project I have going on right now. And I'm considering classic fantasy any fantasy books that go into the 1980s. With the beginning of the 1990s, we've got The Wheel of Time and A Song of Ice and Fire, and some other books which allowed for the tremendous popularity that fantasy has reached today. Now it is a tremendously popular genre, very diverse genre, all kinds of different great fantasy novels out there right now. But I became more interested in classic fantasy. Well, I've always been interested in classic fantasy, but earlier this year, Grammaticus from his great channel, he talked me into reading The Chronicles of Amber. And that's a book or a series of books that I've intended to read for years and years and just hadn't gotten to it. And he talked me into reading it, and I was really happy that I did. And then I read a couple other fantasy books. I read classic fantasy books, The Anubis Gates by Tim Powers, which was fantastic, and The Broken Sword by Poul Anderson, which was wonderful. And it made me think about all of the classic fantasies that either I've never read or I haven't read for years. And I decided to put together this list of fantasies that I really need to get to, and will get to. It might take a while. I'm juggling a lot of things, but these are the books, the classic fantasies that I really feel like I want to get to sooner rather than later. And I'm sure I'm missing some very important classic fantasy works that you should remind me about if I am missing them. Just if you see something you think I should read, or think of something that you think I should read, then just let me know and I'll add it to the list. But I've got a list of 12 right now, so let's talk about them. So I have mentioned that this is going to be the next classic fantasy series I read next, which is Elric by Michael Moorcock. Magnificent series, Elric. I have read the Elric books before, although it's been many years. It might have been since the 1980s that I read all of the Elric books. And actually, I've never read all of Elric because now there's a new Elric book that's out. And there are some other Elric adjacent things that I haven't read. So I'm going to read it all. And so, yes, Elric is going to be the next thing I get to. But after that, I'm going to get to Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser by Fritz Leiber. Another series that I read, but yeah, again, I think it was the 1980s when I read this the last time. This classic sword and sorcery series by Fritz Leiber. You hear people talk about this on BookTube, but probably not as many people as should talk about it. This is a great series, really interesting series of sword and sorcery stories. A lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. I remember that about it. But it's been so long since I've read it. There's a lot about this series that I've forgotten. So this is going to be the series that I read after Elric, for sure. So Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. The next, The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison. This is a book that I read probably when I was too young to really read it. I remember I was thrown off a little bit when I read it when I was a kid by the language of the whole thing. Just the style of writing has kind of an archaic style, a deliberate archaic style. And that threw me off a little bit. So I want to revisit this. Just to revisit it as an older guy who probably will understand it a bit better than the first time I read it when I read it as a kid. The next one is the Gorman Gast novels by Mervyn Peake, which is just a brilliant fantasy series. And I remember it being very strange and really interesting, and definitely a series that has been very influential on a lot of other fantasy books that came after. So yeah, definitely these are books that I want to return to. Next, The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany, or Lord Dunsany. I've read most of Dunsany's work. The King of Elfland's Daughter, however, is one that I have not read for many, many years. I think it was one of the first things I read from Dunsany, if I'm remembering correctly. It's been so long. A lot of his other work I've read more recently, but this one I have not. So this one I want to get back to. Next is a series of books that I've never read at all, and that is The Dying Earth by Jack Vance. I've always kind of thought that this series was science fiction, but I've since been corrected by many, many people who have informed me that no, this is actually a fantasy series, and a tremendously influential fantasy series by Jack Vance. I hear a lot of great things about this series, so definitely want to read it all, and I will be reading it. Next, The Once and Future King by T.H. White. Again, another book I've never read. And Steve Donoghue, for one, speaks very highly of this book. Other people, not so much. But it's one of those books I want to judge for myself. Again, another tremendously influential book, so I want to get to it. Next, Vericonium by M. John Harrison. This I read part of. This came out as a series of paperbacks. The book I read was a paperback book, mass market paperback, but it wasn't all of Vericonium. But I remember it being really, really good. And I want to read the whole thing. So M. John Harrison's Vericonium. The next one is The Dragon Waiting by John M. Ford. And this is a book, again, that I heard about from Steve Donoghue. And he ranks this as a great fantasy book. And I had never read this. I've had it for a long time. It's lurking on my Kindle and has been forever. But I've never read it, so it's about time I read this book. Next is Silverlock by John Myers Myers. This is a book I found a paperback of, and I had never heard of it, and I thought, well, this is just some ridiculous book. But no, people tell me how great this is. Apparently, this is a great book, which I had just never heard of until I picked up this paperback. So I need to read this book. Silverlock, obviously. The next is a controversial choice, apparently. This is The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant by Stephen Donaldson. There were 3 trilogies. I'm committed to reading at least one of them because I want to judge it for myself. This is probably the fantasy that I hear the most conflicting things about. Some people hate this series of books. They just hate it. And some people love it and think it's a masterpiece. And I have heard all different things in between. So, having heard all of these different conflicting reviews of this fantasy, I feel like I need to read it for myself. I'll at least read the first trilogy. Maybe I'll hate it, but maybe it's great. You know, from what I've heard, it could be either one of those things. And the last one on this list is Mythgow Wood by Robert Holdstock, which I admit, yeah, I should have read this by now, but I haven't. And another one of those books has been, sitting around kind of on a TBR since I started my channel. I first heard about this book when I started my channel a few years ago from a viewer. And I have it, just haven't read it. So I need to read it. So those are the classic fantasy books that I need to read, that I need to get to. But like I said, did I say it? If you think of any fantasies that should be on this list that I haven't put on this list, let me know. Put it in the comments down below, and I'll add them to the list. This is an ongoing project. I don't really expect to finish this anytime soon, if ever. So yeah, any classic fantasies you think I should read and talk about, put them down in the comments below. That would be awesome, and I will catch you next time.